All right. Welcome to the Essential Libertarians, giving you the tools for self-governance. I'm joined by Insanity is Free, Jeremiah from Agris Nexus, and soon to be Anarcho-Unity. We'll have more on that. And we have an amazing guest today, one of the best thinkers in contemporary American thought, Keith Preston from Attack the System. And he talks about Anarcho-Pluralism and how different schools of anarchy can work synergistically together or not, which might be helpful as well. Keith, it's a pleasure to have you on.
Oh, good to be here.
All right. So before we get into the topics, I want to talk about the concept of that World Federation of Anarchists that you brought up, because I'm very interested to learn more about that. And I'm also interested to learn about Iristian, a little bit of that, but just wanted to get your thought on one thing, because it's been a contention among anarchists. Me and Jeremiah had a huge debate about it. Based on your perspective and all your experience, in post 1991, after post Sayed Barre regime in Somalia, after all the warlords stopped fighting each other, would you consider that a state of anarchy or something closer to minarchism?
You mean the Somalian system that emerged in the early to mid 90s?
Yes.
Well, the technical term for what that is critarchy. Critarchy is a system of rule largely through tribal traditions and clans and elder systems. So it's something that's somewhat outside the Western traditions that most listeners are probably familiar with. You know, it's not liberal or conservative, or it's not European anarchism or modern libertarianism, but it's anarchistic in the sense that it tends to lack a central authority. Rule is done largely on the basis of customary norms rather than codified law. People who are in positions of leadership are there in a way that's sort of a natural meritocracy. Kind of like the oldest guy or the most respected guy in the community or whatever is going to be the one that's viewed as sort of the ultimate authority. And then you go by what this guy says because you respect his opinion, not just because he's pointing a gun at you or something like that. So critarchy is the technical term for that, but it's anarchistic.
Okay. So actually Jeremiah, I'd say it was more correct on that. And I think we do see a similar system of that with the elders in Afghanistan and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
So what I wanted to touch upon today.
Like my take on that was always that, like, it's in order to be anarchist, you have to start at philosophical principles, and these people did not want to oppose archonic structures. They just had like a less centralized version of it where they were competing warlords. But the word lord is in the name for a reason. It's because it still mimics those structures. So for me, that was always my contention. So
yeah, it's like I said, it has anarchistic elements, but it's not anarchism per se. They wouldn't call it anarchism. They would defer to it in terms of their own traditions and terminology.
Makes sense.
Yeah,
and I was going to ask about,
but they definitely don't like AFRICOM. So I mean, they're at least close on the board with a lot of American anarchists in that variety.
Yeah. Well,
fuck AFRICOM.
Like anything like the European Union, AFRICOM, NATO, BRICS, that's all bad. I was going to also ask about one contemporary thing. So whether or not they put Trump on the ballot or not, I really don't care, because I'm either going to vote for Jill Stein or I was talking to Jeremiah Cornel West or Mike Rectenwald, probably from Mises. But I'm a big secessionist. I'm not necessarily an accelerationist. People mistake that. But what are some good ways to promote, if you're not in the political arena, from maybe an agorist perspective, some of the tactics of panarchist secessionism, or pan-secessionism, as you call it?
Well, I think one thing that's happened in recent times, as far as fairly mainstream activism, is the way that you see local communities setting up sanctuaries for all kinds of things, irrespective of what their specific beliefs are. For example, for a time, it was fashionable in some more liberal areas to have an immigrant sanctuary city. So they would actually provide refuge to immigrants being hunted down by ICE, or in some places they have what amounts to a de facto pot smokers sanctuary, where you have these enclaves in some states now where you have legal or quasi-legal marijuana. And then in some of the more conservative regions, you have what they call Second Amendment sanctuaries, which are gun sanctuaries. There was a big controversy about that here. I lived in Virginia, and some years ago, when we had a very strong Democratic administration, they were trying to tighten state gun laws, and then you had a lot of the more rural areas and smaller towns declaring themselves to be Second Amendment sanctuaries, saying, "F you, governor, we're going to do what we want." And none of the people involved in any of the things I just described would call themselves anarchists for the most part. I mean, maybe a few people here and there, but they wouldn't think of themselves as anarchists. They probably think of themselves, if depending on the issue, progressives or conservatives or something. But it's a way that quasi-anarchistic values or practices can be advanced, even if the people involved aren't calling themselves anarchists. Of course, there's also the issue of dual power structure. I actually gave a talk to a conservative group probably about, 5 or 6 years ago, where I talked about something called the conservative anarchist solution, because what they were interested in was what's going to happen as the United States, eventually falls apart due to, debt collapse and all of these other things that we see on the horizon. And I was saying, well, the main thing you have to do is build a dual power structure or an alternative infrastructure, because the main thing you're going to be worried about is, well, when the electricity doesn't work anymore, where are you going to get electricity from? And this is something that you can do with just people of any political orientation. You can start building preparations for what's going to happen when things deteriorate even further. Because the way American society is going, I think we're going to see a lot of the problems that we have seen in the poor countries around the world. For example, in some of the poor countries, it's frequently the case that electricity will go out for a while, or the internet will go out for a while, and transportation systems aren't efficient and things like that. So how are you going to try to maintain these kinds of services that people need or depend on as governmental institutions and government allied institutions continue to fail? It's not really something that you have to have a big ideological framework for. You have to identify a problem and go do something about it.
Okay. And I'll say,
what's that?
Yeah. He said parallel society.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, or it's been called dual power is one term for it. Or I mean, it's very similar to what agorists advocate. The anarchist Murray Bookchin, if you've ever heard of him, he was big on this. He was big on this idea of dual power, parallel institutions. Old school anarchists were into this, like anarcho-syndicalism. That's a lot of what that was. They had this idea, well, these anarcho-syndicalist industrial unions, they were going to be the basis of economic organization once the state goes.
Yeah. Well, what's ironic is I think maybe instead of building a wall, maybe let's go to Mexico and learn how the Zapatistas do what they do, and then import that here. If we can import anything, I don't want to import from Mexico. Would be the ideas of that, maybe Anarchia in Greece, Rahova in Syria.
Mm-hmm.
I guess
another really interesting example from Mexico was a town called Cherán, where the local people there, it's largely indigenous people. But they, in Cherán, they threw out the police, they threw out the political parties, they threw out the organized crime cartels. Although they're not that happy with the outsiders that go and try to relocate there. They seem to be somewhat insular. I mean, I think somewhat for good reason, but it's really an interesting example of a quasi-anarchistic community. And again, they don't call themselves anarchists. If you ask them, "Are you anarchists?" they say, "What are you talking about?" But they're more rooted in their own indigenous culture. But it's very anarchistic.
Yeah, I saw that on Vice. The only thing I didn't like was they said, "Oh, you have to run for city council; it's mandatory." But okay, fine. It's not the perfect, idea of it. But I think we're getting close with some models like Rahova, Anarchia, the Zapatistas, even the Amish here in Pennsylvania are doing pretty good. The Quakers are relatively anti-war, and I even told people this: look, if I can open Twitter, and I don't see hospitals in Gaza, if there's any left standing, being leveled, if I don't see buildings in Lebanon being leveled, I will be okay with using candlelight for 2 or 3 hours and having the internet go out for 2 or 3 hours. I can go for a walk. But sending destroyers to Yemen because, they're mad about losing some cargo is, to me, beyond ridiculous when people can't even make rent. So I know people don't want to hear that. They're like, "Oh, Kareem, I want my livelihood. I want, the In-N-Out burger all the time and this and that." And I say, well, if you really want a good life, then now's the time to oppose the pharmaceutical industrial complex and military, and not like say who should run it. Like a lot.
Well, the thing is, when people make that argument, well, with anarchy, I'm not going to be able to get my Uber Eats delivered to the front door. I think that they have a misunderstanding of how a voluntary society or an anarchistic society would work, and they overrate the current society. I mean, the a good example is all of the economic fallout that we've seen in recent years with inflation and stuff like that. What is undermining your livelihood more than inflation when food costs doubled in the space of a few years? And this is a government induced problem here. That it's not natural inflation. The value of food hasn't changed that much, according to the law of supply and demand in the space of a few years. In fact, just the other day I was reading a piece by not by Stefan Kinsella, but I think a friend of his, where there was this economist that was estimated that minus the state, the average person would be 8 times richer than they are now. Now I don't know if that's true or not. I'm not an economist, but I often tend to shy away from fantastical predictions like that. But I could see a theoretical framework for that, where because one thing the libertarians and Marxists both have in common is they have this idea, well, in the future, minus all the problems they see in conventional society, we're going to have a society of so much abundance. Everything's either going to be super cheap, with no inflation or whatever, like the libertarians, or according to the Marxists, we're going to have so much abundance through productivity. You can just go take stuff for free. And I could actually see that happening, minus some of these kinds of institutions that we're critical of today as to how pervasive it would be. But I actually discussed that with an economist friend of mine once, and he argued the same thing. He said, yeah, it's probably true that some people can make enough money, selling postcards with, pictures of birds on them because they like to take pictures of birds and make a living at it.
Well, I mean, the 1950s, or even, like you said, you've been an anarchist since the 70s or wherever it was. So, I mean, I'm not saying I shy away from things of like utopia and stuff like that, because that's not good. Like everyone who wants to create a utopia, Idi Amin, Stalin, when you talk about utopia, that's bad. But let's just take into practical number crunching practicality. The American empire spent $2 trillion on Afghanistan, and probably that's not even counting the black budget projects. For $2 trillion, I'm not Bernie Sanders, but you could, the millionaires and the billionaires, but you could feasibly, with the amount we spent in Afghanistan, clear everyone's debt, give everyone a pretty nice house, medical kit, like everything. And I'm not even arguing for any type of redistribution among governments. I'm just saying the amount of waste it engages in and destruction is insane. To me, that could be better spent on anything else, considering, as far as I'm concerned, from the Vietnam era on, advanced technology does not seem to not only win wars, it gives you a hubris to think, oh, I'm the big bad dog around because I have, I don't know, a javelin or a destroyer, and then it's not as effective as they find out, and then you lose all these wars, and then it's just money that was spent for no reason other than to make contractors rich. I could be incorrect in my analysis, but
no, the war on terrorism, of the last 20 years, 22 years, or whatever. I think the official cost of that was something like $6 trillion, and of course that's just the official cost. So that I'm sure there are plenty of other costs. And that's just in the last 20 years. And going back a lot further, you mentioned the Vietnam War. That was extraordinarily expensive. In fact, a lot of the economic problems the United States has now are directly traceable to the Vietnam War, particularly an individual named Richard Milhouse Nixon. It's interesting to go back and read up on the economic policies of the Nixon administration. What he wanted to do was basically engineer a false prosperity that would help his reelection, and they did it through taking they abandoned the Bretton Woods system and they threw off the gold standard and they started pursuing these inflationary monetary policies. And during Nixon's time, there was an economic boom. But the time to pay the piper for that didn't happen until a few years later, because I grew up during that time period. So I remember, in the late 60s, early 70s, things were great economically. I mean, you could, rent an apartment or house for like $200 a month, I knew tons of families that, you had a family of 4, 5, 6 people on one working person's salary. Then there was an OPEC embargo against the United States in 1973 in response to America's arming Israel in the Yom Kippur War. Golda Meir essentially engaged in atomic blackmail of the United States. I could get to that in a later point. But that's when the cost of fuel started going sky high. And I remember fuel was rationed, so you could only buy fuel on certain days of the week. Like if the last number on your license plate was an even number, you could only buy fuel on even number days. So if you say the number is 3, right? So that means you could only buy fuel on the 1st, the 3rd, the 5th, the 7th. Or if it was that's an odd number. Then if it was an even number, it had to be it could only be the 2nd, 4th. I remember I was a child then, but I remember hearing adults talk about this all the time. Are you odd? Are you even? And then the cost of fuel just kept spiraling and inflation kept spiraling. I think between the mid 70s and the early 80s, the value of the dollar decreased by something like 50%, whereas,
the productivity gap.
Yeah. Let's see, I think if maybe, something like, I think it was something like $600 in 1975 was worth about $200 by 1982. It was terrible inflation. It was, in fact, I even remember the first time I ever saw gas being sold for more than $1 a gallon. I remember riding by a gas station and they're selling regular gasoline for $1.06 a gallon. And I remember thinking, isn't there like a law against that or something? That's like robbery, I mean, nowadays, it's great if you could get gasoline for $1 a gallon, but So, and all of that is traceable to the stuff you were talking about, like some of the policies that came out of the Vietnam War era.
Yeah. And what's kind of, go ahead.
Go.
What's kind of sad about it is you look at all the economic potential to do whatever it is we could have done or could do, and that's been wasted. And that's also another reason I started looking at like getting anarchists to work together. I'm like, maybe this was built upon, and I'm not saying I dislike all the founding fathers. I like Thomas Paine, and there's varying degrees of ones I'll tolerate, but I think it was built upon the false premise that a minarchist system, even though that's a cousin philosophy, would say, hey, we'll just have the government just do taxes, roads, and maybe military, and it will stay small. And the pattern I've seen is, whether it's minarchists or authoritarian Marxists, because I consider communists more Kropotkin, Bakunin now, Malatesta, but every authoritarian says, I'll just do X, I'll just help Idi Amin, so I'll just help people, Ugandans are poor. Oh, Pol Pot says, I'll just help with education. Oh, Bernie Sanders says, I'll just help with this. Just a couple things, man. And then it always becomes, well, then we have to do X amount of things. Mm-hmm. So the way I think to stop that is
just go ahead.
To have different,
like that. I thought there was a pause.
You're good. The way I think that to really solve that and to solve Robert Nozick's invisible hand, before I just argued anarcho-capitalism would fix everything, and now I'm arguing, okay, let's have contradictions, like have a syndicalist in your interview, have a syndicalist militia in a factory, and then working for ANCAPs, then they duke it out, then you have the Stirnerites and the Buddhists and the primitivists. I guess my question to you is, it's actually what's really tough, other than seeing the images from Gaza, which is mentally draining, what's even more mentally draining is to get agorists to be friends with ANCAPs because they're arguing you want to use a voting system, you're a statist, and syndicalists have called me a neo-feudalist, and then they ANCAPs say the whole dirty commie Pinochet thing. I'm sure you've heard that. Then both of them are like, the primitivists want to go out into the woods, they're horrible. I'm like, and they want to kill grandma and don't believe in life support or medicine. And I'm like, guys, and then I'm sure I haven't met any techno anarchists, but how, I'm not saying we should all get along, but how do you see this federation working, and how do you see more cohesiveness coming together? Sorry, that's a long.
Yeah, no, I understand. I've used an analogy to churches. If you look at the different types of churches, like the Protestants are kind of like anarchists in the sense that there's so many different types of them with so many different ideas, and they're always splitting up and going off and forming their own new church because this group over here baptized somebody the wrong way or something. I grew up in Protestant circles, so I used to see that all the time. You have a church of 25 people, then it splits in half, and then you got two 12-person churches, because they got one article of that creed wrong or something. Now the Roman Catholic Church is more like communism, where it's you got the guy at the top. It's like giving the orders. No offense to any Catholics listening, but there it's more centralized, and you have an institutional body of authority, and they pronounce the doctrines and that kind of stuff. The party line, with the chairman of the party at the top.
Yeah.
But I think that nowadays, in many countries, you have separation of religion and state, where it's not that religion went away or nobody practices religion, but it's not a state institution. It's that it's polycentric, where you have the Presbyterian Church has its own governmental systems and policies and rules and laws and practices, and as does the Roman Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church and the Unitarian Church and Islam and Judaism and Mormonism and all of the different religions. And I think panarchism would be kind of like that. You wouldn't have a central authority telling everybody what to do. Instead, you'd have a lot of different kinds of voluntary groups that might have widely divergent ideas and beliefs, even contradictory ideas and beliefs about a lot of things. But it's not a unitary system that's being imposed from the top. And then there might also be shifting coalitions and associations or federations that are used to address some particular issue. Like one example I gave once is I may have mentioned this in one of the interviews I did with Todd Lewis, but like there's this thing called the World Council of Churches. That's like this international federation of churches, and it includes a lot of different Protestants, and the Catholic Church, I think, is a part of it, at least unofficially. And there are also some sectarian Christians that don't belong to it because they think it's too ecumenical or whatever, and that's fine. Just like you find anarchists like that too. But if you had this kind of transnational federation of anarchist militias or something, I actually think that might be a deterrent to some of the kind of stuff like what we're seeing going on in Gaza right now, or what happened in Rwanda in 1994, or what happened in Cambodia in the 70s, where you have all these pernicious governments that are conducting massacres. You have something that's some kind of counterbalance to the development of something like that.
Okay. And yeah, sorry, Jeremiah. I know you had some questions. I cut you off.
Well, okay. I mean, it was more just follow up. It was like, because like you talk about the Vatican and like the centralization of power, like they were like I know you recently like cross-posted my article against Nazis and the 3 things they don't want you to know about them, that was from the Free Thought Project, and that article was like something connected to like all of the Western influences that sort of supported the Nazis, and like I think that and the combined factors of that and the Western forces creating the Middle Eastern terror threat through Operation Cyclone and the funding of bin Laden's camp in Khost and the $53 million that they gave to the Taliban before 9/11, like all these things, all these power connections at the top, basically to me what that all implies is that it's not just the cost of war and the cost of all these houses and all the stuff that was destroyed by the war that we'll never get back, it's also the cost of like the funding of the enemies to begin with. And I think that like a real good way to get anarchists of a variety of sorts on board with this mentality is to tell them that not only are the enemies of like the governments, uh, generally like pissed off for good reasons because their houses have been being destroyed, or their lives, or inflation has taken their savings, or any number of other abuses and usurpations. But like ultimately, if we got rid of the government, we would lose a lot of the funding for the enemies, because the state has to create its own enemies. It can't have them organically. It has to have like these constant boogeymen especially in the neoliberal era, around Nixon, Carter, sort of. They have to have their own enemies in order to like advance. So like the fact that Prescott Bush and the Bush family and the Koch brothers and all these people got their original money from Nazis, that should be concerning to any libertarian, and it should be concerning to every anarchist, and can be used as a platform to say that like we could unite very easily against this structure by just stopping supporting those who create the problems to begin with. And that's going to involve knowing all these connections. It's going to involve not listening to certain linchpins, like, you talk Catholics. Catholics can agree on certain things in the authoritarian sphere. That maybe, Matt Walsh and Nick Fuentes are more similar on their fascism and their attraction to 16-year-olds, then, maybe we should like oppose these people. Maybe we should like say that these people are the old dinosaur bones, and we can discard them from society and unite on better principles. Like that's my approach. I sort of think if we can point to the fact that these people are creating their own enemies, and also the kinds of problems that they claim to oppose, like, maybe you shouldn't say that you're against groomers while promoting fucking 16-year-olds, Matt Walsh and fucking Nick Fuentes and all these other people. Like maybe we could get unity based on understanding that the system relies on creating itself.
Yeah. Well, if you're interested in the relationship between all of these different interlocking international systems and how they create their own enemies, you may be interested in the work of Anthony Sutton, if you've ever heard of that. Anthony Sutton was a scholar at the Hoover Institution back in the 60s, and it was a very mainstream, conservative-leaning think tank associated with Stanford University. The same place where you find guys like Thomas Sowell and Victor Davis Hanson and all that today. But Sutton started doing research on international military relations and international financial relations, and observed how over decades there around the world, various supposed capitalists, supposed communists, supposed fascist countries had all been working together to engage in the exchange of military technologies, including with countries that were supposed to be enemies of each other. For example, he was doing a lot of his research during the Vietnam War, and what he found out was that the communist countries, for example, would get loans from international financial institutions, and then they would use that to buy Western military technology, and then they would provide it to the North Vietnamese, while at the same time the American arms manufacturers are providing the same technology to the South Vietnamese. Like there's a book called "The Best Enemy Money Can Buy" by Anthony Sutton. He had a lengthy trilogy about this that talked about the interlocking financial relations between Bolshevik Russia, the Third Reich, and the Roosevelt administration. At the time when all of these are supposed to be at war with each other.
I would say they were at war with each other, but the Warburgs and the Rothschild and everybody's bankrolling them from behind, saying, yeah, they oppose each other, but then they're also bankrolling that. But one thing I was curious about is, to prevent, from a pan-anarchist perspective or pluralist, however you'd say it, there's a guy named Robert Nozick who wrote Anarchy, Utopia, and the State. And one of his concerns primarily they brought up with Stefan Molyneux back in the day is, what if something is so successful in a syndicalist or a commune's more successful, a decentralized commune, like Maltesta would have or Kropotkin would have, that's real successful, or even I don't picture this with a primitivist state, but an anarcho-capitalist state. Say a defense agency is number one, and they just keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Is there a way that pan-anarchism kind of stops the invisible hand from taking over? And then the invisible hand, I mean the encroachment of a state through non-coercive means by being the most efficient. Does that make sense?
Yeah, like a natural monopoly type of situation. That's what
Yes.
Nozick was concerned about, that a
Yes.
defense agency would grow to the point that it became a de facto state. Yeah, and of course, that's one of the Marxist critiques of libertarianism. They say, well, the market produces that inevitably. I think that, again, you have to look to past cultures and other cultures to focus on that question, because there have been in past cultures many different types of societies that would have customary rules that were intended to prevent this kind of thing. For instance, in the ancient Judaic culture, they had a concept called jubilee, which was basically that debts could not be extended past a certain number of years. And the reason for that was to prevent a whole class of debtors and a whole class of creditors growing up, where they have this parasitical relationship, kind of like the U.S. economy now. And this was just a customary tradition, where, courts or whatever the equivalent was, they just wouldn't recognize debts that were technically past the limit imposed by Jubilee. Just like a modern court wouldn't recognize a slavery contract or something like that. And that's just one example. I mean, there are many examples from many past cultures where they had these kind of built-in, cultural or institutional mechanisms that were intended to prevent these kinds of things from happening. And it wasn't the same thing that modern socialists envisioned, where you had a powerful state that expropriates all the wealth of the rich people and ostensibly distributes it fairly. It was just more of a check and balance type of thing. It was sort of built into their social structures.
Okay, that makes sense.
Like Brayon Law, fucking Taoism with Lao Tzu, all that shit. Like all these more ancient societies where you're gonna get better structure because it's like more communally forward.
Yeah, well, there's a reason why most traditional religions tend to look askance at usury, because they know that that's what it tends to produce. That usury tends to produce this class of financiers that end up being the state or the overlords of the state, and that's how you get a class of parasites at the top and permanent debtors at the bottom.
Okay, and one more thing I was curious about. I'm sure you know Larkin Rose.
Yeah.
So he had, and I still love this video, statism is a religion. However, he said the post-Marxists defined it as an ideological superstructure.
Right.
And I was curious, because a religion has like, okay, maybe, you make the Shahada, you pray 5 times a day, where I'm from, or you like, Pentecostal or Catholic, there's certain things you want to do. Is there a fundamental difference between what the Marxists are attributing to the state as the ideological superstructure, where it takes it from a mafia to like, or a regular religion that somebody might practice? Because there's a religious basis for some anarchism, like Buddhist, Hindu.
Well, a religion is, I'm a sociologist by profession, but I tend to adhere to Emil Durkheim's definition of religion, and that's just a religion is a worldview that people use to give meaning to and interpret reality, and then there's a social structure that's built up around it. So, having a religion is no different than having a philosophy or a political ideology or an ethical system. I mean, saying you're a Buddhist or Christian or Muslim is no different than saying, well, I'm a utilitarian, or I'm a deontological ethicist, or I'm a virtue ethicist, or I'm an existentialist, or I'm a Hegelian or logical positivist or something. So there's nothing wrong with religion in that sense. But the Marxist idea of the ideological superstructure is based on the way in which ruling classes create an intellectual framework or cultural framework to legitimize themselves. In other words, it's basically a scam. For example, in a lot of the ancient societies, they deified the emperor. The emperor was worshipped as a godlike being. I think the ancient Egyptians believed that claimed that the pharaohs were the descendants of the sun god Ra. There was the Roman state cult of the emperor, where they deified Caesar Augustus and made him into this godlike being. The Japanese had a system like that during World War II. And in the monotheist traditions, they have traditions like or concepts like divine right of kings. That was common during the Middle Ages, where Christianity theoretically you're not supposed to have multiple gods. Although some people say, well, the Trinity is really multiple gods, but that's a theological argument. Yeah. But in Christianity, you're not supposed to have, not just anything can be a god. So they have this idea, well, we have the divine right of kings, where the Pope or the king or whoever it is, he's the right-hand man of God on earth. God put him here to rule over the earth. So that's why you need to listen to him. And in modern societies, it's the same way. Modern states have an ideological superstructure that is intended to legitimize the particular state system, and it can be called the social contract, the general will, the dictatorship of the proletariat, the Führer principle, the Juka idea. There's different widely divergent variations of this, but there's always some smoke screen set up to claim that for some reason the state has its power legitimately, and what the state says is correct just because they're the state. It's kind of like the Wizard of Oz fairy tale, where you've got in the movie, the classic movie, you've got the little man behind the curtain, and he's just this ordinary, nondescript type of character, but he's working these controls and creating this massive image of himself as something great and powerful. And that's really all an ideological superstructure is. Now, the Marxists also claim that it grows out of material conditions. So whoever controls the economy controls the state, and then they create an ideological superstructure that suits their own interest. And of course, they may do it by appealing to traditional culture and things like that. Like the Khmer Rouge, when they were building themselves up in Cambodia prior to the revolution in '75. They actually claimed they were monarchists. They were saying, well, we're just going to restore the traditional Cambodian monarchy, and we're going to restore the Angkor Wat, which is the ancient medieval Cambodian civilization. They weren't saying anything about what it's going to be slavery on rice paddies for you folks.
Yeah. Well, I've never read once in history like Pol Pot saying, "Oh yeah, I'm going to take everybody out. Hey, you better watch your," or Idi Amin saying, "Watch your back." It's all like, no, I just want to help out. I just want to do a couple things, man. Like, why don't you just give me a little power? Let me do one thing. But I feel I don't know if this counts as an ideological superstructure, maybe these things, but like there's a funny meme that says it's not theft if you have to fill out a form. So if you say, oh, it's not extortion, it's a W-2, you got to fill out your W-2. And people are like, oh, it's not theft. I filled out a W-2 and I turned it in on TurboTax. So
yeah, we've got another great illustration of that in our system, and that's campaign financing. Campaign financing is nothing but bribery. You pay politicians to do things for you. That's bribery. But it's called a campaign contribution if you fill out the right paperwork. And if you ever take a look at somebody who gets busted for an illegal campaign contribution or something, usually it's somebody that fell out with the wrong people. But what they'll get them on is, well, they didn't have the paperwork correctly. Like a good example is this guy Dinesh D'Souza. He's like this conservative filmmaker.
Yeah.
He got busted for an illegal campaign contribution some years ago, and I think he went to jail. And that's basically what it was. It was it's basically the same thing everybody does, except he didn't have all the T's crossed and all that, and he pissed off the wrong people somewhere in the IRS or State Department or something. So they busted him for illegal campaign contribution, but that's all it is. Campaign contributions are bribery, but they legitimize it by saying, oh no, you've got to fill out a form, you've got to go through these steps to make it a legitimate bribe.
Yeah, it's fun. It's crazy like that. And another one, actually, you'd be surprised to know the people I've argued, most people like, oh, it must be liberals. No, I haven't argued with them too much. That generally the Joe Biden crowd hurts my brain, and so does speaking of deifying people, calling Trump God Emperor is horrible. That's the worst thing ever in the gold statue. That makes me even sicker because nobody really likes Joe Biden. They just did it as their what they thought was a defense mechanism, but wasn't any better,
Right.
in my opinion. But the people I've argued most with, especially around the beer flu times, were minarchists. I'd go there, wave the Gadsden flag, we'd both be doing it, work as an ideology. Then they're like, we just have to get, and tell me if this is an ideological superstructure. I'm sure you've heard this being in Virginia. Keith, I like you, you're a good anarchist, but we just need to get back to the Constitution. If we just got back to the Constitution and got the right statists in and configured all the chairs in the right place, everything would work. The CIA, Gaza would come back and everybody would be jubilee. I'm like, you'll never get psychopaths or people who want that opportunity, in my opinion, to follow the Constitution. And even if you did, the alphabet agencies who always ask me, do you hate the ATF? Yes. But I don't think the CIA or the FBI or the MIC cares. Lockheed Martin don't care who's president. They don't care about the Constitution. They just need to get their stock portfolio up and fight in Yemen and Ukraine and everywhere else. So correct me if I'm wrong.
No, you're absolutely correct. Yeah, you get, even in some libertarian circles, you get these people that I call constitutional fundamentalists. You know, for them, the Constitution is like the sacred parchment. You know, it's like this document is magic. If we just say the magic words right, you know, then the building's going to fly, or you know, we can levitate buildings or something. In fact, I've often noticed that in American culture, religious fundamentalists and constitutional fundamentalists are often the same people. You know, and I think that that's understandable because they're used to thinking in this way. You know, we have sacred documents, we have magic words. You know, if we just pray to the right deity, you know, then things are going to work out for us. Again, no offense to religious folks who may be listening, but yeah, but I do think that something I come across all the time on the political right is this kind of constitutional fundamentalism. Yeah, and I think you're correct. I mean, if somebody, you know, like even when Ron Paul was running for president, I mean, I thought he had a lot of good ideas, but I also knew if he actually got elected, first they'd try to force him out like Nixon, or if that didn't work, then they would try to, you know, have him taken out directly like JFK. Or if that didn't work, they just take the whole system out, like they did in Chile in 1974. So, you know, and as you were saying, I mean, the real ruling class are those who control the national security apparatus, the intelligence services, the military-industrial complex, the financial institutions. You know, they don't care who the state is. I mean, at that level, you know, I mean, like for example, it's interesting how much continuity there is on foreign policy between Democrats and Republicans. The rhetoric is different, but you know, like right now, if the Republicans were president, you know, when it comes to Gaza, they would be pursuing exactly the same policies.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I argued this was actually, I called Jeremy up one day, well, I call insanity is free. And I said, the only difference, it seems to be neocons and neoliberals. You get someone like Dan Crenshaw or Lindsey Graham who's just like, I like to bomb Iran, let's go. And the neoliberals will say, no, we need to bring democracy and hope and bunny rabbits and, you know, a McDonald's there and values. And, you know, like Hillary Clinton will make it sound like nice, like, oh, we just want to bring democracy to Libya. I'm like, what does that mean? Same thing as Lindsey Graham, but it sounds kind of nice and fluffy. Right. Someone made a good comment though.
Well, if you notice stylistically, like Tony Blinken, you know, I call him the metrosexual in chief. You know, he's got this kind of refined, you know, he's like this refined hipster persona. I think he plays guitar and records his own songs and puts them on Spotify or something. You know, he's like the cool guy imperialist. You know, and whereas, yeah, if it was, you know, any of the Republicans, like if Tom Cotton was president, he'd be saying, well, I think we need to annihilate the, you know, I mean, they would be pursuing the same policies, just the rhetoric would sound different.
Tom Cotton literally said on Twitter, Gaza ain't a big deal because Hiroshima. And I'm like, literally thinking, and I almost stopped myself because I'm like, don't get in trouble. But really, I like Billy, like Senator Cotton. So it's okay if we Hiroshima your neighborhood in Arkansas. You know, would that be okay with you if that? But
I raised the same point. I said when Timothy McVeigh bombed the Oklahoma City bombing and the Oklahoma City Federal Building in 1995, and killed 150 people. He was associated with some militia in Arkansas. So should the federal government have retaliated by just going and massacring people in Arkansas?
That's ridiculous. JC said something really interesting. He said, I've noticed some diehard minarchists, even though it's a cousin philosophy, I'll agree. But he said some minarchist libertarian types seem to be the biggest status in the sense that it's more of a religion to them than regular Republicans or Democrats. Meaning,
well, when you talk about minarchists, I think you have to differentiate between different types of ideas. Like the serious minarchist would be someone like Robert Nozick, somebody that believes in a limited government only for defense and crime control or something. But these people who identify as constitutionalists, some of them are serious. Like Justin Amash, who used to be in Congress. I think he's a serious constitutionalist.
He is. I've met him personally. He is.
And Ron Paul is a serious constitutionalist. And this guy, Tom Massey, I think is. But most so-called constitutionalists aren't. Most of them are just nationalists or neocons or, basically fascists. They worship the Constitution not because they care what's in it. To them, it's like the Bible or something. It's just a sacred icon.
Yeah.
Well, and like on that note, it's funny because a lot of libertarians falsely claim to support Lysander Spooner. And what those people will do is they'll take he tried to start his small business and he tried to and then the government suppressed him. This is evidence we need a free market. But then they'll say, them damn commies, we need Pinochet style shit in America. Throw them out of helicopters.
Yeah.
And Lysander Spooner was a wobbly. He was a socialist and he was an anarchist socialist. And people who try to claim that Lysander Spooner would agree with their policies while endorsing fascism, or the people who claim that the Constitution should be followed originally, but ignore the fact that the Bill of Rights wasn't even in the original Constitution. So a lot of these people are Second Amendment people, and they're like, oh, I'm a constitutional originalist. And I'm like, how far back are we going? Before blacks and women could vote, before before the Second Amendment and First Amendment existed? What the fuck do you mean by constitutionalism, you bitch? And these people usually can't answer that question very well. And it all falls down to the same principles. Both camps of those people are in very similar camps ideologically. And when you break it down, they hate the left more than they love liberty. Yeah. And the real solution is that they we need to oppose these people and their hijacking of terms and concepts that they don't understand.
And I'll add one thing to that. I talked with a Trump supporter right before the 2020 thing, and they said, I'm a strict constitutionalist, Kareem. I said, okay, you own a house. Yes. Do you agree with eminent domain? They're like, yeah, Trump can build a border, and if he needs to knock out some houses, that'd be okay. Are you okay so you're okay with eminent domain? Yeah, if they do it correctly. Can we do it to your house? No. Well, wait, I thought you were a strict constitutionalist. Can you not? That's not even slavery or anything. It's just eminent domain. Is that okay with you? Can I tear it down? That's a pretty big deal. Just because it doesn't happen to you, people are like, well, they're not going to tear my house down for a shopping mall, but they could tear some other guy's house down for a wall or whatever. I'm like, if you don't agree with that, then...
Yeah, they can use eminent domain for anything. I knew a guy that I think his grandmother had her house taken to build a park. It was there's they can pretty much use that power for any purpose they want. Yeah, well, a lot of the people you're talking about, though, the constitutional conservatives, again, some of them are serious, but a lot of them are really they're just nationalists. They're tribalists. I mean, they identify with what they think the American tribe was supposed to be, because that's what they heard in the 4th grade or something. And so they worship the flag, and if they like guns, they worship guns, and
and I do have respect for
it's a very tribalistic. It's like rooting for the Lakers versus the Celtics or something. I mean, it's they root for what they think is their home team.
Yeah, I got you there. And look, I have respect for Ron Paul and Massey and Amash, but I'm actually curious. Maybe 4 sets of groups, but I'll ask it in 2 separate questions. I was trying to figure out, okay, well, how could ANCAPs and ANCOMs or syndicalists work together? And I actually think in your pillars, if you take the pillars from that interview I watched, you have the economic, ecological, the Christian, and then maybe the cultural one. So I agree with that. Do you see Pierre Proudhon's philosophy of mutualism, or having some kind of understanding of mutual aid, being what I would call an anarchist connector philosophy when it comes to ANCOMs and maybe anarcho-capitalism and agorists? And do you also see solar punk, even though I'm not, maybe not, so as a way to connect primitivists and techno anarchists?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. All of these things sort of intersect with each other in different ways. Like I've got a friend of mine who's an ANCAP, but he likes Proudhon. He said, "Yeah, Proudhon's basically just an ANCAP." He said, "I don't agree with some of his views on interest. You know, it's so it's not that much of a difference." Or yeah, the interest, the solar punk versus the technophile. You know, that's sort of a, you know, I guess. A technophile means to primitivist ends or something. Yeah, well, and not only that, but there's also all sorts of topical issues that different types of anarchists can unite around that aren't necessarily ideological. You know, like for the Gaza war is obviously one example. You know, in the 1960s,
war on drugs, terror.
What was that?
Just listing more, like the war on drugs and the war on terror as well. Go ahead, though.
Right. Yeah, well, in the 1960s, Murray Rothbard, you know, the Mr. Anarcho-Capitalism, he actually joined the Peace and Freedom Party, and the Peace and Freedom Party was a leftist party. It consisted of Trotskyites, Maoists, Black Panthers, and Yippies. You know, and he was the Libertarian faction, or he and his associates were. And the sole reason for that is that Peace and Freedom was basically a single issue party organized around opposing the war in Vietnam. You know, so you know, even though I think their presidential candidate was Eldridge Cleaver, the Black Panther, and then I think Jerry Rubin was the Yippie was their vice presidential candidate. But I think and Rothbard ran for governor on their ticket once, and governor of New York on their ticket. But that's a case though of where, you know, I mean, like Gaza is a good example since that's what's going on now, because if anarchists or libertarians or really anybody with common sense can't unite around opposing the Gaza war, then what's the point? You know, it's like, so if genocide is not a red line, then what is? You know, so I think that these are, and through working on these topical issues and these big, you know, immediate emergency issues, I think that helps people of different philosophical stances to build commonality with each other, you know, and including non-anarchists, you know, including.
I agree. Actually, well, I have a really big question because me and Jeremiah had a talk about it. I was going to ask about like a legalist and nihilist, but maybe you can leave that to another day. Because, well, here's one thing me and Jeremiah were talking about. So there's a few individuals that I highly disagreed with before. I would not watch their content. I was actually saying they were wrong. And I'll go ahead and you know, name them because I've asked them to debate me respectfully. That was like Jackson Henkel and Haz al-Din, who, you know, he was saying like, okay, Putin should win in Ukraine and stuff like that. And I'm like, no, I'm against that war too. There seems to be non-anarchists who, some are good, like Abby Martin, Syrian Girl. I like those. But there are some ones who seem to be on, I guess the technical word is tanky side or left-wing side, who say, yes, all the good things that Gaza, you know, needs to be free. Palestinians should be free. They should fight back. They should have autonomy. But then also I know if that did happen, they probably would be like, oh, well, you know what, we need to promote authoritarian Marxist ideas. So how do we reconcile? Because I've thought about, like, should I be retweeting someone if they say they're a tanky but they're pro-Palestinian, or should I just go with the anarchists who are pro-Palestinian because I'm pro-Palestinian myself, even though I can say like I don't like any government? Sorry if that's a weird question. How do I reconcile that? Because I'm finding myself, unfortunately, looking at some people who are statists. I'm like, I do watch Jackson Henkel sometimes, and then part of me has to pull it back and be like, look, Kareem, you know, because, you know, I'm even talking to a girl who's from Ukraine now. You know, if he was reporting on something else, you'd be super opposed to what he's saying. So And I'm not saying I particularly hate anyone, but sorry if that's a weird question. How do I
No,
wrap?
I get it. I've dealt with these issues quite a bit. Well, I think in the case of something like Gaza, you have an emergency situation, so you've got to take friends and allies wherever you can find them, irrespective of what else they believe. Like it's literally a triage situation. So I mean, yeah, I mean, you followed me on Twitter, so you probably see that I retweet Jackson Hinkle and
Yeah.
Haas, and all of these
I
people.
was shocked, actually. I saw you retweeted, which I agree. Here's the thing, and I almost retweeted it too. And I was Putin said Gaza's been the biggest graveyard for children recently,
Right.
and I did see a retweet, and part of me is like, should I retweet that? But then here's the thing: I'm in Jeremiah's server. I have writers, and they're trans, and I have a lot of trans friends, and I know Putin recently banned trans. So like, part of me is like, I agree with him on Gaza, but I'm against what he said about the LGBT community. I have friends who are queer anarchists and anarcho-feminism. So what do I do? I don't know.
I've dealt with that issue. Like Erdogan of Turkey, he's very pro-Palestinian, but he's also anti-Kurdish, and I have Kurdish anarchist friends. So that's an issue. Again, when a genocide is in progress, you take it friends wherever you can get them. Irrespective of what else they're doing. And that's another fight, another day. That's my take on that kind of thing. Even with it, not just with world leaders, but with domestic politics. You've got Marxist Leninists like Haas and people like that. Like, one of the best groups out there on international issues like this is the Center for Political Innovation. Now, that's a tanky group. That's Caleb Malpin's group. And so, but they're good on anti-war stuff. But there's also groups like that from the right. I mean, there's you have conservative constitutionalists like Chuck Baldwin or folks like that, the Constitution Party, and they're very socially conservative and not friendly to, say, gay people or whatever at all. But they're still good on war or some things. So I mean, I think it all comes down to value judgments, in particular, again, contextualization. Like Gaza is an emergency issue. That's a genocide in progress. So, anybody that speaks up against that, I think, needs to be heard.
Yeah. Even people I don't like, I'm listening to them now. I'm like, okay, well, like, I even watched the Piers Morgan, interview with people, about stuff. And I don't agree with everyone he's interviewed, or even Bassem Youssef on everything. But I agree, looking back all the way to the Nakaba to now, that putting people in a condition like that where they can't have any freedom, limiting their movement, and then just mowing them down, and then lying about it on October 2nd, can't even get the real things. And when they go on Twitter Spaces, they can't answer any questions about, like, okay, what's the real count? What's going on? Are you targeting civilians? Jackson Henkel even brought this up. He said during World War II, 72 journalists got killed over the whole thing. And I'm an anarchist, so I don't like it, but 90 journalists in Gaza have been killed in 2 months. So deliberately targeting kids and journalists. I would be fine if they just said, fine, we're going to fight, military versus military. Then I'd be like, okay, whatever. Like, whoever gets wiped out gets wiped out. But then I was seeing your posts, and you said about Iristian, and I'm like, what's Keith talking about here? And I looked up Gaddafi Jr., who I'm not a fan of Gaddafi, but seems, I don't agree. I know why the U.S. took him out, but I'm not a fan of Gaddafi. But then I saw a Confederate state. And so interesting is they recently said Trump, they knocked him out of the ballot for signing a Confederate thing. Now, I'm the one statist I do like in American history is Robert E. Lee and Jefferson Davis for saying, hey, we're going to pull back. How, from America or for Western nations, as a reasonable solution, because I don't believe in the two-state solution. It's kind of funny. I was talking with Scott Horton, and I'm like, I'm an anarchist. Why was I saying two-state solution? I think there's something wrong with me.
Well, before you even bring anarchism into it, when it comes to this two-state solution, the issue there is that Palestine, geopolitically is not an independent country. Greater Israel rules over that entire region. Greater Israel is Israel proper, East Jerusalem, the West Bank, and Gaza. All right. So the Palestinians are in the West Bank and East Jerusalem and Gaza. They are like a people within a state that is a subordinated class of people. I mean, they're like the Dalits of India traditionally, or like black people in America or Native Americans in the United States during much of American history, or they are like the the Jews and the Gypsies in the Third Reich occupied territories. So it's like that's one thing that the American media does. They try to portray the Israel-Palestine thing like it's two countries fighting each other, like Iraq and Iran in the 80s or something, and it's not. Israel is a state that rules over that entire area and is oppressing a subordinate class of people that are considered to be by law and political policy to be an inferior class of people. So that's actually what's happening. And Hamas is not a country. It's not a government. It's a resistance group. Whether you like their philosophy, whether you like their methods, they're more like the Black Panthers or a group like that from American history that represented a subordinated, oppressed group that engaged in acts of resistance. So what Gaza is doing, what Israel is doing in Gaza would be like, let's say back in the 1960s when you had you had a lot of race riots, over segregation and stuff like that. So the American government just went out and started obliterating black neighborhoods, with bombs and sniper attacks and all the stuff that we see these horrific videos of. That's what's really happening. I mean, Israel's policy is to eliminate Hamas through eliminating the Gazan population entirely. What Israel wants to do is ethnically cleanse the Gaza Strip by either killing or forcing the Palestinians into Egypt, and then resettling the Gaza Strip with Israeli settlements, as they tried to do once before. And then the end game is in the Mediterranean off the Gaza coast, you have natural gas and petroleum and stuff like that. They want to access that. And they want to make Gaza part of Israel proper. And then with that oil wealth and the funny thing is, whenever I discuss this with, mainstream normie Americans who are pro-Israel, they say, oh, no, Israel's just trying to defeat Hamas. And the thing is, Zionists will say that's what they want to do. I've been on Facebook threads and all that with Zionists, and they'll say, yeah, that sounds great. Let's do it. Kill them all, seize the oil. It's really interesting. It's terrible, but it's interesting to see because, what Israeli officials say in the Hebrew language is what is different from what they say when they're on American television. Like you see all these official spokespeople for Israel, they speak perfect American English. Some of them are Americans, and they talk about, well, of course we're trying to avoid civilian casualties. Of course we're trying to go by the Geneva Conventions, yada yada. In cabinet officials, when they're speaking in Hebrew, when they're writing in the Israeli press, they say, no, we should kill at least 10,000. We should kill at least 20,000.
I've seen all this, like the clips on TikTok, and it's the age of like the internet, so we can see that. Yeah. And one thing that drives me crazy is this. I don't believe Trump got help from Russia. Let's say he did or didn't. But let's even say he got a little help. Let's say some oligarch passed him, even though I don't believe it. Let's say some oligarch hooked him up. Like the media just couldn't stop like Trump, Russia. But AIPAC is right there. And AIPAC says we buy politicians and we got this guy for this. They have amounts too. Like I bought Tom Cotton for like 50 grand or 5 million or whatever it is. I got Dan Crenshaw for 8. Like they're shopping. And they're like, oh, yeah. And to me...
Yeah, and like...
Go ahead.
Go. Oh, all I was going to say is, like, it's more than just, like, the like, it's not an independent country. It's the reason it's not. Because, like, Sykes-Picot and the McMahon-Hussein correspondence, like, real early on, the reason that the West won against the Ottoman Empire was because of the help, was because of the help they got from people like Palestine, and they got that help based on promises that they would allow Palestinian independence. And then after they like successfully pushed back the Ottomans, they were like, hey, Palestine, go fuck yourself. We're going to establish this as mandatory Palestine under British rule, and then gradually filter in enough Jewish population until we can do a Nakba in the mid 20th century. And it's like, people don't want to look really that far back and realize that the reason Palestine isn't an independent country is because the alleged Free West betrayed them and lied to them and then controlled them and pushed for their eradication. And it's like, that's a different story than they want you to believe. They want you to believe that it's like some vacuum situation that started on October 7th. They want you to believe that the Nakba didn't even happen. That the Nakba didn't even happen. And they want you to believe all this shit because if you look into the funding, then it implicates a whole lot of American politics. It implicates everybody affiliated with it. That's one of the things. Like, I personally would rather put my energy into people like Abby Martin rather than Jackson Hinkle, because I don't like pro-war people. And I find that a lot of these people are willing to ally with some truly unscrupulous characters like Scott Ritter. And Scott Ritter's a twice convicted child predator. So like, I feel like there's room for criticism of that particular shit. Like, we can't have the anti-LGBT pro-pedophile caucus on our side if we want to have a whole lot of people after the dust settles. But what I will say is that, like, when it comes down to it, there's a huge potential for allying across the board, because you can point to all this corruption and all this money and all this fucking greasy palms greasing each other, and point to the fact that the U.S. has literally puppeteered this whole thing for infinite conflict.
Yeah.
That the U.S. has literally puppeteered this whole thing for infinite conflict. Sorry, my internet fucking sucks.
Yeah, it happens. Yeah, well, if we look at what's going on in Palestine, what we see is that the U.S. has its hands in all of that, because all of the countries involved in that are heavily funded by the United States, not just Israel, but also Jordan, Egypt, all of the Gulf states. All of those are American client states. And if the United States told those countries, well, look, you either end all of this that's going on in Gaza, or you're not going to receive any more U.S. funding. You're not going to receive any more U.S. armaments. You're not going to receive any more U.S. trade favors or any of these kinds of things. Well, then they'd start to change their tune. If they wanted to survive as countries, because it's U.S. money and armaments that props up a lot of these places and keeps them from being overthrown by their own people. When it comes to foreign policy, I'm definitely one of those blame America first left-wing anti-imperialist.
Me too. I'm hardcore. I'm hardcore.
Fuck Western hegemony.
Yes, and actually, and the MIC. Here's I guess two questions kind of into one. From where I'm sitting now, I don't see obviously the federal government doing that. So I saw Iristian. I like the idea of there are people in Israel protesting Netanyahu, the Likud party, and there are people in Palestine who are not happy with what's going on. So I think a Confederate state is probably the best thing I can think about. I don't know how to bring that into actualization. I don't think that'd be the best solution, but that'd be better than what's going on. So how can someone from America, or from another country, bring awareness to Iristian? How could it come about and end all this?
Yeah, well, the plan that Gaddafi Jr. came up with, for a settlement, sort of a confederated system in the Holy Land, where it's self-determination for all of the ethnic and religious and cultural groups there. That idea, there's variations of that idea as well. Like, I know a while back I saw Kim Iverson interviewing an ex-IDF member who had a similar view. I think ultimately, and Rabbi Yaakov Shapiro, he's a Torah Jew who was an anti-Zionist. He has a similar viewpoint. So there's a lot of variations of this idea. It's not just the Gaddafi Jr.'s idea, but I think ultimately it's something that we in the rich countries, the big countries, have to push for, because if the people in places like Europe and the United States are pushing for this and exercising pressure on their own governments for this, then the Israelis, the Egyptians, the Jordanians, the Saudis, they're going to have to start to listen, because those countries are so dependent on the United States. And so it's really, a lot of that has to do with what we do here. It's, I know years ago, about 20 years ago, I used to know people that would go to Palestine to check out what was going on there. And I'd say, that's great to go check out, what's happening for real. But a lot of the real work is here in the United States, because the United States is what bankrolls all of this. It's, without, we see how, we see the symbiotic relationship between the government of Israel and the government of the United States. Of course, among people who talk about these issues, there's a big debate about who is the dog and who is the tail. The left-wing anti-imperialist, Noam Chomsky-like view is basically, well, Israel's just a client state of the United States, and it's doing what, the bidding of the United States, because it's basically just a de facto military outpost. You have some far-right people, obviously anti-Semites, but also, some Jewish anti-Zionists who will say, no, actually, Israel has so much power within the domestic United States through the Israel lobby and the not only that, but the Christian Zionists that Israel indirectly controls American foreign policy, at least in the Middle East, maybe not everywhere. And I actually think that the truth is probably somewhere between that. It's a symbiotic relationship, because Israel's relationship with the United States is one where Israel is a guaranteed export market for American arms manufacturers. It's just like, let's say you had an industry that you were the owner of and you made tennis shoes, and then the American government gave billions of dollars to Mexico every year, and with the condition that they have to use that money to buy tennis shoes from your tennis shoe company. All right, well, that's gravy for you. That's great. That would be a guaranteed export market for your products that are underwritten by U.S. taxpayers, and you don't have to do anything. You just make money, right? And that's the relationship American arms manufacturers have with Israel and with Saudi Arabia, and with the UAE. All right, so exposing and opposing that is really what needs to be done. Most Americans are extremely ignorant about the whole U.S.-Israel thing, about the Israel-Palestine conflict. Again, they think it's two countries fighting each other. No, it's not. It's a subordinated population under a state. It's they think there's another thing is they think this is just a carryover from ancient conflicts from the Bible or something like that. No. This is modern.
My old man kind of gave me the rundown, because we were in Egypt and there's a whole presentation about it. So, but I'm taking a different take than he does, because he has a more of a statist view of it. So, and I really like your idea of you said you wanted to bring anarchists all together to oppose I guess you want to call it the globalist, Zionist, Wahhabist alliance.
Right.
I'd even say more. I blame the West for BRICS now, because the way they acted, all these countries want to buddy up. But I also see BRICS as a problem. And I even see people like Javier Milei saying, oh, I'm an ANCAP, but now I want to side with NATO. And and even if he does some good things domestically and some bad things domestically with his drug war, that's not what I'm looking for in an anarchist. I am looking for the ability that we all cooperate to oppose that globalist,
right,
Wahhabist alliance. How can I start pitching that on social media because you're saying the work's here. How can I pitch that on social media to get that going, and also through my YouTube work? Because I'm going to start ramping up the YouTube work with Anarchist Unity, maybe even trying to contribute to attack the system, because those are the systems. I think NATO, the Wahhabists, the Zionists, and even this BRICS alliance needs to go. I do not like people when they're like, oh yeah, Kareem, we'll make everything good. We'll stop Israel from killing people, and then Putin and Xi can be in charge of your destiny. I'm like, hold the phone, man. No.
Yeah, that's an important point, because I see places like Russia and China as basically rebellious provinces at best within a global system. It's kind of like when Trump was president and Jeff Sessions was attorney general, they were trying to come down on some of the states for their sanctuary cities. but it's still it's controlled opposition, or a battle within the empire or whatever. And a lot of people don't realize that the BRICS was created by Goldman Sachs. Right? So I mean, if that's not controlled opposition, then what would be? So
and partially bankrolled by Rockefellers, right?
Yeah, well, even with the sanctions that are going on now in response to the Ukraine war, I mean, the West still purchases petroleum from Russia. What Russia does is they say, okay, we can't sell it directly to the West, so we'll just sell it to India, and then they'll sell it to the West. It's that's the kind of thing Anthony Sutton used to write about that I was discussing earlier. These different supposed warring countries, scratch each other's backs behind the scenes. So yeah, I think exposing this, most people, as I'm sure you've encountered, many normies, when you talk about this stuff with them, they think you're crazy. So the fact that more and more people are becoming aware of this, I think, is an issue. Like the Israel question, younger generations of Jewish people are becoming more and more aware of this in the United States, in a way that the older generations aren't. Because nowadays we have more information available. I mean, you can go on social media and see what's happening in Gaza. You don't have to just read about it in a book buried deep in a library somewhere. And that's true of a lot of other things. So I think that making people more aware of what of how these systems work and what's really happening is really the key. And then you'll start to see changes. Like. Even with the mass protests we've seen against the bombing of Gaza, I mean, Israel's been bombing Gaza forever. And this is the first time we've really seen protests on this level. And I think that shows that there's an increased level of awareness about the issue, in a way that there wasn't before.
Okay. And then I'll just throw like one or two more questions. I really appreciate all your knowledge here. Go ahead.
Real quick, though, like in the effort to reach out on social media, maybe like make emphasis on the connections to domestic problems. For instance, a huge amount of surveillance state features invading people's privacy were programmed in places like Israel and Ukraine, which is why those are vassal states for the U.S. because they help with the manufacturing of the U.S. intelligence industrial complex. The police brutality, a lot of cops were trained by the IDF and Mossad. The war on terror, a lot of people oppose a lot of things there. You could say that, the IDF has been working directly with American troops to train those people in cross-training programs, and that's why Krav Maga is so popular. There's so many things you can bring up where it's directly tied to American suffering, that the American government works with Israel, and you could just point to that. And you could also point to the fact that AIPAC connected politicians are some of the most anti-minority people here. You could point to the fact that AIPAC connected politicians are big central bank proponents, and a huge amount of the reason that we have the Fed system that we do still moving toward the CBDC, global currency, biometric superstate. We've got all this shit, and it's connected to the US's chosen alliances. And Israel being a major one, you could point to Saudi Arabia, you could point to Ukraine, you could point to the EU, you could point to, many places, vassal states in Latin America and AFRICOM and all this shit. But Israel is a big linchpin too.
Yeah.
And you can point out to people that this is all parts of central connection points, that if you just knock out that one peg, you're going to end up with a whole lot more freedom.
Yeah, I speaking of Israel and surveillance, a while back I saw Scott Horton debating a Zionist on Tim Pool's program, and the Zionist guy was saying, "Yeah, but we depend on Israel for technology." And I'm like, "Yeah, surveillance technology, the police state technology. Yeah, right. Yeah.
Don't threaten me with a good time."
Yeah.
Yeah. So that brings me to the really big thing is I that's kind of one, you say, big purpose looking at that. One thing that occurred to me, especially watching a lot of your videos and learning about it, is one thing occurred to me is all this bad stuff is happening, in my opinion, because and I literally mean all, major political theories, and I'm getting this from Putin's main thought guy, Alexander Dugin. He said the main political theories of the world were like Nazism, fascism, communism. And then I said, what's Dugin's philosophy that counters this? They said Eurasianism. I'm like, what is that really? They're like, it's Heideggerian fascism. I'm like, So there's no theory other than maybe the Constitution, if you consider that a major. There's no actual anarchist. There's no fifth theory anarchist coalition or pan-anarchism. And I think that needs to exist as a framework, not so much to tell people what to do, because I hate central planning, but to be like, hey, here's how you could organize syndicates into federations to work with ANCAPstan. Here's how Agoristan could work. Here's how ANPrimstan, and here's how mutualism work. Here's how solar punk makes people like technology, people who hate it, work together. Here's how Steiner people can work with people who are more religiously affiliated. Do you think you said in the interview there could be a theoretical thing. Do you think there's a need for a book like that or a thought form like that to be the positive to the negative, instead of just saying, hey, I don't like where we're at. Here's how this could work. Here's the building blocks. See how you can put this together with Kropotkin and Rothbard and Zerzan and all that.
Well, I have a couple of books like that myself. I have a book called Attack the System. Most of that was written back during the George W. Bush era, so some of the content may be a little dated, but the theoretical framework is similar to what you're talking about. And I've got another one called The Failure of Anarchism, where I'm critiquing a lot of things and some of its problems. But yeah, well, Alexander Dugin is basically a Russian imperialist. I mean, what he envisions is a Russian counter-imperialism. He wants to counter the Atlanticist imperialism with a Russian imperialism. I mean, that's why we have the Ukraine war. We have the Western Atlanticist globalism versus the Russian revanchism. They want to rebuild the old Tsarist era Russian Empire. And those are not compatible goals, so that's why they're fighting. But even there, it's still something of an intramural conflict. Because, like I said, the West still buys Russian oil indirectly and all of that.
Yeah, what I want to do is really just, I'll be like, hey, with your Russian oil purchase, hey, I'm going to give you a good deal. It's like, what is this? You put Anatomy of the State and Conquest for Bread and running on emptiness and Pierre Proudhon's book and all these Huxley books everywhere. Like, yeah, read them. My thing is to promote like in different ideas, like, hey, here's anarcho-capitalism, here's agorism, here's Konkin, here's Rothbard. And hopefully what will happen is things will start to break down and people are like, I don't like the way things are being done here in this part of wherever, Beijing. That maybe the Uyghurs find I know this is going to say, you're going to say, Kareem, you're crazy. What if the Uyghurs found Rothbard and they're like, I think
there are ANCAPs in China. Okay. I've seen articles by them on some ANCAP sites like LouRockwell.com and things like that.
See, it's working. Take that, Jeremy. We're going to win. So if that is the case, and that's a highly concentrated government power, I think, I'd love to read your book and then even maybe come up with like a functional thing with everything you've written and make it like fifth political theory or sixth political theory to counter Dugin and everything. Because he has an interesting observation that says everything is multipolar. And he says like, okay, there's a multipolar, that there's like the Shia Islam, there's this. I'm like, okay, but I'm technically, I was born Sunni and I'm a Sufi because I found there was a Sufi version of anarchism. I was like, ooh, give me that. So I'm trying to find the anarchist roots in everything. Like, oh, Tolstoy's are Christians. Boop. Yep. So I think, you think there could be something.
There's an interesting book about that talks about, it's a book on anarchist history. And it goes into all these hyphenated tendencies, and it talks about anarchist movements in different parts of the world. It's by Peter Marshall, and it's called Demanding the Impossible. Okay. The Impossible. It's about 800 pages long. It's a magisterial work, but he talks about quasi-anarchist movements in medieval Christianity and medieval Islam and Chinese anarchism and quasi-anarchistic practices among all kinds of indigenous cultures or traditional cultures, as well as the more modern stuff, Bakunin and Proudhon and Kropotkin and all of that. He mentions ANCAPs. He talks about John Zerzan.
Yeah, well, and just to be clear, I think, because you bring up Lou Rockwell, I think it's a good time to remember one of the ways that we could lose in the end, and that's if we let ourselves get undermined. Because, like, yeah, I mean, sure, he wrote for that showed up on LouRockwell.com, but so did a Daily Stormer article. So, I mean, if we gotta, like, if we're gonna be, like, serious and, like, take this to its conclusion, we do have to be sure that, like, our sources aren't being corrupted. And I do think that, like, probably a site like Lou Rockwell was taking a decidedly anti-communist, including ANCOM, approach to anarchism, even in a Chinese sense. So, I mean, I don't know this author. I'll look into this. You're free to send me any links you want.
Well, the Lou Rockwell site is strictly ANCOM. I mean ANCAP rather, and they've always been big on outreach to conservatives. As long as the paleo libertarians have been around since like the early '90s, outreach to conservatives has always been their main MO. Now they've always been consistently anti-war, but other than that, they sort of appeal to the conservative culture war, type of paradigm. Like, what's really the wrong with the state is it's the enemy of God-fearing good Christian America.
Yep.
So in fact, they've sort of latched on to the Trump bandwagon.
Not digging that.
Yeah, well, and the reason I brought that up is because, like, the Daily Stormer is very much against what Israel is doing to Gaza, because they don't like Jews. And it's like, if it was anybody else in charge, if it was Nazis in charge, Daily Storm would love that shit.
Right.
Yeah, they would. They're not principled.
Right. Well, that's like, there was some program that was supposed to be broadcast. I think the host system shut it down, but a while back there was a program that was going to be broadcast. It was a dialogue between some black nationalist guy and David Duke. And that the theme of the show was going to be the Jews are the problem or something like that, So it's basically, racist, black racists and white racists coming together to hate on the Jews, basically. Now, this was before the Gaza crisis, the current Gaza crisis started. Yeah. But you find these kinds of things in these really fringe circles. I have them showing up in some of my social media and stuff all the time.
Deeply unfortunate.
Yeah, that sucked.
Very counterproductive.
Just one thing, sorry, Keith, just wealth of knowledge. You have, like, out of all the American thinkers and everything, like, literally I've listened to Dugan, Peterson, all this, Ron Paul, everyone. You're the best one that I found, Leeson, out of all the Mises guys as well. So
wow, thanks.
This World Federation of Anarchists that would act like the world's monotheistic religions and churches, if that came into physical manifestation tomorrow, I have two questions. Would you include illegalists and nihilists, people who think anarchy really is chaos? Because I have reservations about those two hyphens. And how would it work? Would it be an actual building, or would it be a website, or would it be a collection of buildings and websites? How would it actually
it could be all of that. I mean, if we had a World Federation of Anarchists, I guess some of these groups could have their own buildings, they could have their own websites, and they could have their own militia communes and marijuana farms or whatever, but I don't know that there's any one model for that. Like, it could be any of it. As far as your first question, nihilism is just simply a worldview. It's not really, it doesn't really apply. It doesn't really imply any action. A nihilist is somebody who's basically a radical skeptic. They're a skeptic of, they're a moral skeptic. They are a metaphysical skeptic in many ways. They tend to believe that values are entirely subjective or relative. Like some of your radical postmodernists, like your Foucault type thinkers, or Nietzsche, and some of that kind of stuff. That's all a nihilist.
Yeah.
And now what? And an illegalist. When it comes to an illegalist, the illegalist anarchists are people who believe in breaking laws to fight the state. So, without the state, I don't know that they would even exist. Now, if you have people who say, well, being an anarchist means you get to rape somebody if you want or whatever, well, that's something obviously you have to push back against. But I've actually known very few anarchists that had that kind of outlook, and there is a undercurrent within some anarchist circles where you find people with outlooks like that are attracted to anarchists because they think it is chaos, so that's what they want it to be.
Yeah, that is actually an issue that Errico Malatesta, my favorite ANCAP writer is actually Jack Lloyd, and then Murray Rothbard by that. But my favorite ANCOM writer is Errico Malatesta, if I'm saying his name right. I butcher Italian names, so sorry if I said it wrong. But he said one of the primary problems him and Kropotkin saw was that people were like, ooh, anarchism, what does that mean? And they're like, oh, it's against the state. They're like, and they said they weren't getting into it because, oh, they liked Conquest for Bread or Anarchy by, or Bakunin. They're getting into it because, oh, we get to fight the state and like chaos. And it's kind of, that's why I got out of the punk rock ethos out of crap, because a lot of people are just like, SLC punk is cool to watch, but I'm like, look, listen, at some point you're like, I don't want chaos. I actually want a hospital to go to and bread and food and like water. And so, yeah, I do see a problem in anarchy where even like my bandmates, not picking on them, but if they watch us, like sometimes I'll leave my backpack and my bass everywhere, or sometimes I like will leave stuff and they're like, oh, that's Kareem. He believes in anarchy. And there's always this attributation of anarchy that it just comes back to deliberate disorder and chaos. I think the media has done such a whack job on people's minds that it's almost like pulling, like you said, the Christian Zionists. It's probably as hard to pull that out of people. Like, no, it doesn't just mean some dude running around like beating up people. Anarchy is a very sophisticated system.
There was a classic pamphlet on that written by an Italian anarchist named Luigi Fabrizi back in the early 20th century. And it was called Bourgeois Influences on Anarchists. And basically what he meant by that was how the way he said that you had a problem where there were people drawn to anarchist circles because they believed what the press said about anarchists. Like the press would say, well, the anarchists are these crazy people who are just about chaos and violence and terrorism. And so you get these sociopathic personalities saying, well, what do I sign up for this?
Yeah, then I'm like, no, don't do that. Like, I think that's even more detrimental. I would prefer somebody actually be a constitutionalist, a libertarian socialist, a transcendentalist. I think they still exist. A leveler, a Quaker, do all that type of stuff, but don't join up with anarchy and say, oh, yeah, it's chaos, because there are people. And then I have to go and, do back work and be like, look, listen, I know there are a couple dudes who said they're an anarchist and then they're smashing this and that and they're, smashing mom and pop stores. But that's not what we do.
Being anarchist in name and saying, hey, you're an anarchist, but you believe in the age of consent. You don't like pedophiles. You must be. Yeah, so many people like that. It's fucking annoying.
I get it. And there are people like that who will try and hijack the movement and also just try and hijack anarchist movements for nefarious reasons. Like, oh, I want to be an anarchist because, then I don't have this limitation or that limitation, or I can get away with this. So that's one thing I do want to avoid, because then it causes a lot of backtracking work where I tell people that, and then I have to, then they look at me worse than the people who are doing some of the worst stuff. They're like, oh, Kareem's an anarchist. That's worse than Netanyahu. I'm like, actually, it's not. But the media has programmed you so well that you will think that.
Yeah, well, you have that in a lot of different movements. Like in the 60s with the anti-war movement, you had people that joined the anti-war movement because they wanted to be in the Weathermen so they could blow things up, or you had people that joined the Black Panthers because they just, they would hear that the press say, well, the Black Panthers are just a street gang. So they say, yeah, well, where do I sign up for this? It's so it's not just unique to anarchists. You have that in a lot of different kinds of movements.
Okay.
Yeah, and entryism as well.
Yeah. And maybe I'll pull you, just give you two more curveballs. I'm curious on your thoughts on these movements. And then I know we've gone hour 30, but I was really impressed. Do you have any particular opinions on, it could be both of you, a group that calls themselves the Boog or the Boogaloo, who are, they say, they're kind of a loose affiliation of people who want to stand for Second Amendment rights, different ideas, and also Antifa. Do you have any thoughts on those two? Are you from?
Well, in my case, the Boogaloo Boys, I don't know a whole lot about. From what people tell me who are closer to that, they were originally a split off from the Proud Boys.
Correct.
And supposedly they were more of a libertarian version of something like the Proud Boys. And I think some of them have almost left sounding politics. Like I know there was that one guy that was on Jimmy Dore's program a couple years ago. And, you know, he sounded very left.
We're mutuals on Twitter.
Yeah. So yeah. But other than that, I don't know a lot about them now. And Antifa, yeah, they seem to be a mixed bag. You know, I know people who are closer to that as well, and they can vouch for saying, yeah, there's some good Antifa people. You know, some of the ones I see on social media, I'm not impressed with. But you know, I guess it is what it is. Antifa, though, seems to have a lot of different kind of currents in it. Like I've seen Antifa demonstrations or protests and rallies, and they'll have their Antifa flags, and then they'll have a hammer and sickle, and then some of them will have an anarchist flag, and in Germany, the Antifa actually used the Israeli national flag, the Zionist flag, because I guess it shows they reject anti-Semitism or something. You know, even though Palestinians are Semites, so they probably don't know that. But so it just seems to be sort of a subculture that where you have different elements that are converging, and you know, I suppose I would evaluate them on a person by person or group by group basis. I know people who've had run-ins with them that were unsavory, but I don't know that the whole tendency should be evaluated on the basis of that.
Personally, like I know many people in the Boog. I'm directly Boog affiliated and have promoted Boog. I know many people in Antifa. I'm less affiliated with that, but like I'm totally okay with like anti-fascist action. And like I think one of the things that I've said about both of them is Boog has to be sure to like lose the feds and infiltrators from broader and worse movements. And the same can be said for Antifa. Like, you know, I mean, if you're anti-fascist, great. But if you just want a different sort of authoritarianism, that's not good enough. So there are some people in Antifa who are like anti-fascist and also anarchist. Those people are great. Those people also do a great amount of things. They were part of the Stop Cop City protests. They were a part of the anti-George Floyd protests. They were okay with anti-George Floyd murder protests. They were okay with working with the Boog Boys because they understand that there's some coalition building potential with BLM and Boog and Antifa. And that's the whole thing is like Boog specifically. I don't think it started as a split from Proud Boys. I just think Proud Boys like had some people in the starts of the Boog, but then distanced themselves because they're not okay with leftists. And the Boog was heavily populated by people of a more left persuasion and a more libertarian and anarchist persuasion. And the Proud Boys are a bunch of, you know, racist, fascist cunts. So like ultimately when you end up with these sorts of yeah. I mean but I mean feds are racist fascists anyway. So like I just Boog and Antifa specifically, they get a really bad rap from people who don't look into them. And I think a lot of these things can be settled by actually having conversations, which can be difficult because when you get more radical groups, they tend to be insular and not as willing to talk, or as willing to talk as openly as would need to be in order to clear misconceptions. But I also think that that's one of the things that makes them resilient. So it's one of those things. It's one of those things where really people should talk to people in order to find out if they're bad or not, instead of just believing what other people say. Ask me how I know, because thousands of people hate me because of what I've said about, you know, certain people and groups. And I'm sure that you've had similar vibes from similar circles, Keith, because like when you start talking about building coalitions, you start having to look at why coalitions weren't possible to begin with. And a lot of the division is just system perpetuation nonsense.
Yeah. Oh yeah. I've been battling with all these different sectarian groups for 30 years, 35 years. It never changes.
Yeah, but hopefully we can make some headway. So Keith, I want to thank you definitely for coming on.
Yeah,
I
no
definitely
problem.
have you back. I'm going to email John Zerzan again, and some prominent people. Also, Mises is doing some stuff, so maybe I can introduce you to some people there. Definitely, guys, go check out Attack the System. He has some very, very good articles. I read one on Malay recently saying like why Malay isn't that superhero you think he is. Not going to say he's not done any good, but he's doing a lot of horrible things as well. So go check out attackthesystem.com, especially if you want to understand how different factions work, because they do exist. Mark Passio can argue that they don't, but they do. I don't live my life like John Zerzan. I don't live my life like somebody else. So there is different ways you can live as an anarchist, cynical, Georgism, there's a bunch of stuff here. And there's a bunch of stuff here. Definitely go click on statement, learn all about it, because it is necessary. At the end of the day, though, we need to ally. Any type of anti-state action is good. I was actually thinking about just last thing here, Keith. There's a Chinese philosophy of legalism. Anything you do for the state is good. And I said basically, as an anarcho-pluralist, if someone asks me what I believe, instead of just saying, oh, I'm an ANCAP, I believe Murray Rothbard, or I believe any anti-state action, as long as you're not hurting anyone or their property, is good. Any type of anti-state action is good. Like if it's anarcho-primitivists want to take away the national parks from the federal government, I will get on a plane and help them tomorrow. If ANCOMs want to tear down the city building and say this is our independent commune, I'll be there, So that's how I look at it. I'm going to read Demanding the Impossible. Get your book on failures of anarchism, and we'll be starting Anarcho Unity soon, in conjunction with Attack the System. Jeremiah did a very good job on the logo here. We're going to get that.
Yeah, it's a site in progress.
So yeah, we'll help you with the battling the factions and the coalitions, because I can't think of, aside from my work and family stuff, I can't think of any better thing to do in my life than promote continuity between anarchists to fight these global hegemonies. So
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned the legalist. I know I was a religion major as an undergrad.
Okay.
And I remember having a class once on Asian religions, and it included overviews of ancient Chinese philosophy. And I remember our instructor said, when he talked about the legalists, he said, a good way to understand these guys is that they were the first fascists.
Yeah. Even more than that, my understanding is legalism says anything you do that's pro-state. So if I call myself a Marxist and I say, oh, I'm taking away everybody's land, like the Holodomor is good under legalism, because hey, it was good for the state, right? Everything's good. Like Mao is good because it's good for the state. To me, I'm saying the exact opposite. I'm saying if you do any type of anti-state action, look, if I'll come up with something completely crazy because I've played Fallout. If anarcho-transhumanists raid DARPA and want to steal their technology to use on themselves, I would, and I think everybody's going to say Kareem's lost it, which is fine. If anarcho-transhumanists want to steal government technology for personal use, I would say okay, because it's already been made with theft dollars, so have fun. I don't know any transhumanists. You can introduce them to me. I'd love to talk to them. But yeah, that's how far I go.
Well, that's the legalists in that regard, according to that description, sound almost like Thomas Hobbes. Where Thomas Hobbes had the idea, well, order is primary, so we've got it. The first thing we have to do is protect the state, and it doesn't matter what the state does as long as the state is maintaining order.
Yeah.
Very Saddam Hussein type of philosophy, or it's like order ubales.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. But the problem with Hobbes and all those guys are government to me is a recent invention that of this level, of this capacity. Monarchies could not dream of even 1/10 of the power of this. So I don't even think Hobbes, to Hobbes's credit, could have seen something like the Great Leap Forward, could see the American government the way it is now. And as far as I'm concerned, I want to get everything except anarcho-fascism. I don't really believe that's a faction. I've never seen someone call themselves a national anarchist, or you know, maybe there is anarcho-conservatism, or, you know, even platformist. I would be cool with. I'd even, if someone's even a Georgist, I'd be like, that's a little bit, you know, out of that's
Well,
kind of like,
Georgism isn't anarchy.
I don't know if it is or not. I'm not an
I think there are anarchists and non-anarchist Georgists. There are some Georgists that believe in a state that collects the land tax or whatever, but then there are other anarchist Georgists who believe in like a land trust community where it's sort of like the land is held in common according to Georgist principles or something.
Well, it'd be interesting to see how they reconcile that, because, you know, to me, it's one of those great questions about how closely a system mimics statist systems. Like when you end up with, like, for instance, covenant communities, where I get into these conversations with these guys who are like, I want a covenant community where the everything has to be done according to the central principles of that community. And I'm like, that sounds like statism. And they're, well, like, if you don't like the principles of the community, if you, for instance, didn't consent to the principles because you were raised in the system and born into it and you didn't like sign shit, well, if you don't like it, you can always leave. And I'm like, you sound exactly like the state. You sound exactly like the bootlickers who tell me if I don't like America, I should leave. And no, in fact, that's not how America got started, if I remember correctly. Those motherfuckers stood right where they were and said, you fuck off. So I'm saying you fuck off to every authority figure. And to me, it's one of those situations where, like, the Georgists, even if they claim to be anarchist, if they're trying to say that the community should be able to decide how everything is used, that sounds like statism, and I can't really reconcile that. So it's one of those things where,
yeah,
I guess my internet fucked up, but that's basically the end of the sentence.
Okay. Well, Keith, thank you again. I'm gonna actually get your book, and Demanding the Impossible, and with Anarch Unity,
The
see if
Impossible, I think. Just to get the plug right. The Impossible, Demanding the Impossible, if I remember right.
No, Demanding
Impossible.
By Peter.
Oh, okay, I misunderstood. Right.
Yeah.
So it's Demanding the Impossible, a history of anarchism. And one thing I really want to recommend to, if you're an ANCAP, if you're an ANCOM, if you're an EGOCOM, that's my friend Liz, shout out to him. If you're a Black Flag anarchist, like my friend Mike, then check out Demanding the Impossible, History of Anarchism. I have it in my cart right here. And then also Failures of Anarchists as well. I want to check those two out. And then I'm going to put, it's right here, Failure of Anarchism. I like the punk flag, so I'm going to add that. I'm going to buy those as well. And then we're going to get Anarch Unity coming up in conjunction with Attack the System and work towards a unified anarchist world federation to counter BRICS and NATO and maybe save the world.
All right. Let's do it.
Let's do it. All right.
Pleasure having you on.
Likewise.
Keith, it was a pleasure. This was probably my best episode. So, ladies and gentlemen, this is one of the best contemporary American thinkers. Along, you have legends of Lysander Spooner. I think Keith Preston is that legend for our generation. So you can find him at Attack the System. You can also find Jeremiah at Insanity is Free on Twitter. And you can find Agorist Nexus, which and he works for the Free Thought Project with Jason Basler. And also he's designing Anarch Unity, which will have articles up. You can find me, Kareem6633 on Twitter. And also Essential Libertarians on this channel. And last but not least, I will be running Anarch Unity, giving you all flavors of anarchism and fighting the state. So this is Kareem with the Essential Libertarians, giving you the tools for self-governance. Catch you in the next one.